What if the most famous monument in the world is remembered not for what it was, but for what it lost? The Colosseum stands today as a ruin, but it was once perfection. Brilliant white, polished, alive with statues and banners. So what happened? Who stripped it? Who broke it? And why does its wound feel almost more powerful than its former glory? Before we step into the shadow of those arches, subscribe and like this video. If you're drawn to the hidden histories behind iconic monuments, the politics, the engineering, the slow violence of time, you're in the right place. Stay with me, because the story of what's missing is often more revealing than what remains. And tell me in the comments, do you think ruins are more powerful than perfect buildings? Is it the damage that gives them meaning? I want to hear your thoughts before we walk around this ancient scar. From a distance, the Colosseum looks like a stubborn survivor. A great stone bowl crowned with arches, each opening a dark pupil that has watched the city for 2 millennia. Walk around it, and the illusion fractures. On the southern side, there is a long, ragged absence where the wall should be. An enormous wound that frames sky through its missing ribs. The first thing you notice then is the paradox. An object built to impress with solidity and permanence that now announces itself in absence. Imagine for a moment what it would have been like the day it opened. In only a handful of years, artisans and thousands of laborers raised a quatrefoil of stone so precise that it gleamed. The outer face was dressed in travertine, polished to a near white that would catch the sun and throw back a dazzle to anyone who looked up from the forum. Statues inhabited every arch. Sculpted forms gave the facade an animated edge, human silhouettes against the Roman sky. The seating tiers inside were cased in marble. Corridors and vomitoria funneled a roaring tide of bodies. Overhead, a vast canvas canopy, the velarium, stretched like a giant sail to shield maybe 50,000 spectators from sun and rain. The amphitheater was not only an engineering feat, but an aesthetic spectacle. A tuned combination of light, stone, and movement, staged within a geometry that centered the emperor and the public together in a ritual of power and leisure. The engineers who built it worked in a language of geometry and fit. Blocks of travertine were cut with such exactness that iron clamps, not mortar, bound them together. Clamps set into sockets chiseled into the stone, their ends embedded in the adjacent blocks and secured so the whole mass behaved like a giant jigsaw. The use of clamps allowed a precision and strength suited to an amphitheater that needed to resist massive horizontal and vertical forces. Beneath this outer shell lay a complex skeleton, radial walls, corridors, and load-bearing elements designed to channel weight and people with an efficiency that still impresses modern engineers. It was a machine made of stone, deliberate, rehearsed, painstaking. Yet even monuments conceived to endure are vulnerable to time and to changing priorities. By the time the imperial machine that erected and maintained such spectacles faded, the Colosseum found itself without an owner who considered it essential. The political and financial energies that had christened it diminished. The rituals that filled it altered or disappeared. Without the steady hand of imperial maintenance, the monument was left to a city whose needs were immediate and often mundane. Gradually, the amphitheater was domesticated. Its halls and arched recesses, once reserved for emperors and priests of spectacle, lent themselves to new, pragmatic uses. Families carved living rooms into the corridors. Craftsmen turned vaults into workshops. Stalls and shops occupied former passages. Churches were established within its ribs, and in other corners, gardens took root where dust and debris had accumulated. There are records and accounts from medieval centuries that describe households and rents, leases and liturgies inside the ruin. People who lived in or around the Colosseum were not looters of memory. They were citizens adjusting to the necessities of shelter and work in a city where every useful stone had value. The monument did not progress from sacred to profane in a single moral collapse. It was reabsorbed into urban life as a convenient cluster of space and material. In this sense, the Colosseum was not abandoned as much as reprogrammed by successive generations, but reprogramming has costs. Marble slabs destined for threshold and altar, capitals and cornices were removed and repurposed. Sometimes entire blocks simply vanished from their positions and reappeared elsewhere in the city as walls and porticos. This was not always furtive theft. At times, the extraction happened under official sanction. Permits were issued, contractors counted and labeled blocks, and loads were carted away toward the Tiber and beyond. These numbered stones tell a story of a city that literally fed on its monuments to build new ones. It is historically documented that materials from the amphitheater were incorporated into palaces and churches, among them structures like Palazzo Venezia and, in broader terms, parts of St. Peter's, a redistribution of old luxury into new agendas of power and faith. The Colosseum became, in effect, a quarry. The act of quarrying was physical and administrative. Blocks were pried out, sometimes whole courses. Columns and statues were stripped and reinstalled as reused adornments. Where marble could not be carried or refashioned economically, it was burned down for lime, a chemical reduction that erased sculpture into powder to be spread into mortar. Even delicate pieces of ornament became raw material for the city's rebuilding. Such practices were not unique to Rome. Cities across the world have repurposed their past when survival and booming projects demanded material. Yet the scale and fame of Rome amplify the sense of loss. The visible consequence is not merely missing marble, but a palimpsest of the urban fabric. Buildings that bear in their stones the memory of other places, other centuries, other hands. If stone removal tells one part of the story, metal scavenging tells another. Iron clamps that once stitched blocks together were valuable in an economy that prized metal for tools, nails, fittings, and weaponry. Over centuries, workers pried these clamps from their sockets and hauled them to workshops where the iron was melted and recast. The departures of the clamps left the stone with characteristic pockmarks, rows of small, blind holes that read as scars across the face of the monument. Those pockmarks are an index of two realities. First, the energetic repurposing of the city's resources. Second, a slow structural weakening. Removing clamps that transferred shear and tensile loads diminished the cohesive integrity of wall faces and made some sections more fragile to further stress, whether from gravity, human activity, or seismic shaking. The surface narrative of missing statues and whitened blocks is thus accompanied by an internal story of lost connectors. Human action did not act alone. Beneath the visible drama lay a geological tension. The site of the amphitheater straddles different substrata. In places, its foundations rest on firm travertine bedrock. In others, on softer, filled ground. What had once been a marshy basin or part of the lowlands around the Tiber that was later drained. That unevenness meant that the structure experienced heterogeneous support. For centuries, minor earth movements and the settlement of fills could be accommodated. But the amphitheater remained vulnerable to more dramatic seismic events. In 1349, a severe earthquake changed everything. The shock did not merely bruise, it precipitated a catastrophic partial collapse. Large segments of the southern exterior disintegrated and tumbled into heaps of stone. The result was the enormous gap we see today, a clear, jagged incision through which the inner spaces are exposed to sunlight. The earthquake was decisive, but it interacted with the pre-existing conditions, missing clamps, carved blocks, centuries of unequal settlement, and the constant human pressure of reuse. The collapse made visible the accumulated effects of human and natural processes. After 1349, the Colosseum assumed a new physical identity. Not only a ruin, but an open wound that invited different uses of its exposed anatomy. The southern face, stripped of its outer skin, became a convenient source of blocks and a spectacle in its own right. That spectacle transformed into symbolism. In the imagination of later centuries, the broken amphitheater accumulated narratives. A popular saying grew, and survives in different versions, that linked the ruin to religious memory and suffering. Some traditions began to refer to the site in terms associated with martyrdom. Others invoked legends and prophecies that read ruins as moral or divine commentary. Historians and archaeologists caution against accepting such stories as literal history. Rather, they are part of the cultural reinterpretation that saved the monument from further wholesale dismantling. The Church, for instance, intervened in rhetorical and practical ways at different moments. Papal declarations and the presence of chapels inside the ruin made it harder for authorities to justify total extraction of its stones in certain eras. Whether the declarations were motivated by sanctity, politics, or a combination of both, their effect was to grant the Colosseum a degree of protection it might otherwise have lacked. The story here is complex. Legend sometimes functioned as a shield. Renaissance and early modern elites also played paradoxical roles. Some aristocratic families treated the Colosseum as a convenient park, adding gardens or claiming parts of it for their palaces. The Barberini family, for example, used materials and proximity in ways that tied them to both the ruin and the city's evolving topography. An explicit instance of how noble patronage could be complicit in the redistribution of ancient fabric. At the same time, these elites cultivated the Colosseum as a picturesque ruin, a source of inspiration for artists and travelers who found in its broken orders a sublime aesthetic. So the same months and decades that took pieces away also began a new relationship of appreciation, one that assumed the monument's ruin as part of its beauty. Serious efforts to stabilize and conserve the Colosseum began in different phases, becoming more systematic by the 19th century. Early interventions were pragmatic. Buttresses and supports were added to prevent further falls. Debris was cleared, and certain areas were consolidated to make them less dangerous. Archaeology as a discipline started to peel back layers and to seek the original plan, rather than merely to reuse materials. Excavations revealed hidden works beneath the arena. The hypogum, a subterranean world of corridors, cages, and pulleys that once orchestrated animals and scenery for the spectacles above. When the hypogum was systematically investigated, it shifted our understanding. The Colosseum was not just an open bowl for the crowd. It was a complex stage machinery with a backstage that meshed the biological and the mechanical, the theatrical and the utilitarian. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the tools at conservators' disposal changed in kind and scale. Laser cleaning offered a way to remove centuries of soot and biological growth from the marble without abrasive scraping. This method can reveal the paler stone beneath in a way that both restores some of the surface's visual qualities and helps researchers read inscriptions and tool marks. But laser cleaning is not a miracle cure. It must be applied with care to avoid altering the stone's patina, and its effects on the long-term chemistry of the surface demand monitoring. Sensors have become a central part of conservation strategies. Engineers install small devices that record micro-movements, tilts and vibrations, a kind of cardiac rhythm for the monument. The data streams reveal the monument's responses to traffic, weather and human crowds. They also expose slow trends that might presage more serious problems. This ongoing surveillance is a pragmatic recognition that preservation is not a single restorative act, but a perpetual tending. Still, sensors do not prevent earthquakes or reverse the missing marble. They give managers time to respond and to understand risk. Material compatibility remains one of the thorniest technical dilemmas. Past restorations sometimes introduced new mortars and concretes whose physical and chemical properties are incompatible with original travertine and brick. Differences in thermal expansion, Salt crystallization patterns and moisture behavior can exacerbate decay rather than halt it. Modern conservators therefore emphasize reversibility and compatibility. Where new materials must be used, they aim for those that age similarly and can be removed without harming the old. This is cautious work that privileges long-term stewardship over dramatic cosmetic change. Another reality is urban pressure. The Colosseum sits doggedly at the axis of a living capital. Traffic, vibration from vehicles, and the sheer weight of visitors all play roles in the monument's ongoing life and risk. Conservators must negotiate the balance between access and preservation. Tourism generates funds and justifies the public interest. It also accelerates wear. There is no simple formula to reconcile these forces. Rather, each decision, to reroute traffic, to limit access to certain zones, to keep parts closed for years while studies are made, reflects the trade-offs between present-day utility and future inheritance. When we ask whether the Colosseum is worth the trouble, we must understand what that trouble entails. It is not merely fiscal. The work of preservation requires political will, scientific humility, and cultural consensus. It means accepting that some losses are irrecoverable. No amount of modern engineering can unring the bell of certain missing marbles, fallen statuary, or vanished fixtures. It also means accepting that conservation is not a single heroic act, but a long-term commitment involving monitoring, maintenance, and occasional intervention. Yet the counterfactual, allowing the monument to continue degrading into oblivion, would not simply erase stone. It would sever a living thread of urban memory. There is, however, a paradoxical argument in favor of the ruins as they are. The Colosseum's deformity, its missing southern sector, its pockmarked walls and patched buttresses, is itself evidence. It is an archaeological argument in stone. It records the city's successive needs and choices. Rome is literally built from Rome. The stones that left the amphitheater found new lives as walls, palaces, and churches. The holes and scars bear witness to a city that recycled itself. In this sense, the ruin is a palimpsest, a layered document where absence writes as eloquently as presence. To restore the Colosseum to an imagined pristine original would be to erase that documentary richness. Preservation, then, must be selective and respectful, stabilizing what remains, revealing where appropriate, and resisting the temptation to reconstruct a past that would efface the history of reuse. There are also social and economic calculations that matter. The Colosseum is a major driver of tourism, a magnet that brings millions to Rome. Those visitors support local economies, guides, hotels, restaurants, craftsmen. Conserving the monument is an investment in cultural capital that translates into economic activity. Yet the economic argument cannot be the only one. Heritage stewardship carries intrinsic value, the ability to encounter a material past, to sense the scale of human endeavor, to learn the mechanics of past societies. The Colosseum is a classroom and a stage for civic identity as much as it is an archaeological site. At the same time, we should resist triumphalist narratives that equate preservation with unalloyed moral good. The choices that have led to the monument's current state were often pragmatic and sometimes painful. They reflected the priorities of people who needed materials and shelter. When contractors hauled travertine to build a papal palace, they were participating in a living economy that had different imperatives than modern heritage ethics. Judging those actors by our contemporary standards risks flattening complexity into an easy moralization. A balanced view acknowledges both the loss and the continuity. The Colosseum's stones now hold stories in multiple buildings across the city. Not simply theft, but transfer and recontextualization. So what is the answer to the title's provocation? Isn't the Colosseum worth the trouble? The most honest response is a qualified yes. It is worth the trouble, but worth it in a particular way. The trouble of preservation is justified because what remains of the Colosseum is not merely a tourist backdrop or a romantic ruin. It is a material archive that connects us to questions about engineering, empire, urban life, and the ethics of reuse. Its battered face teaches us as much about the needs of past Romans and medieval residents as it does about imperial spectacle. Saving the Colosseum means conserving a layered witness. The craftsmanship of the original builders, the improvisations of medieval households, the sanctioned scavenging of early modern contractors, the imaginations of Renaissance artists, and the measured scientific care of modern conservators. But deciding to preserve is not an automatic moral victory. It obliges equanimity in practice. Funding must be transparent. Conservation methods should respect scientific standards. Access must be balanced so the public can experience the site without destroying it. And narratives that attach mythical meanings, such as unverified claims of mass martyrdom tied directly to the amphitheater, need to be clearly identified as tradition rather than proven history. Preservation also demands humility about limits. We cannot recreate every lost element, nor can we guarantee eternal stability against the forces of nature and urban life. We can, however, choose to steward intelligently. The Colosseum's deficiency, its missing half, is, paradoxically, one of the reasons to preserve it. That absent portion tells a story more complex than a simple restoration could. The crater in the wall invites questions. Who took these stones? Where did they go? What did citizens of later centuries need that led them to dismantle a monument? That open face is as pedagogic as any plaque. The ruin, then, functions as a physical question mark. It prompts visitors to query, rather than to admire blindly. In preserving it, we maintain a space for inquiry, for historical empathy, for awe tempered by melancholy. Conservation is a negotiation between the urge to return and the obligation to remember. To attempt a wholesale restitution of the Colosseum to its 8th century sheen would be to substitute imagination for evidence. To abandon it entirely would be to surrender a part of our shared urban memory. What conservators aim for instead is to stabilize, to interpret, to make legible the palimpsest, and to keep open the conversation between past and present. If you stand today beneath the rims of the great arches, you will feel both the monument's mass and its absence. Sunlight slants into cavities where marble once carved figures into relief. The hypodium exposes chambers that once worked like backstage cogs in a theatrical apparatus. And if you pause to trace with your eyes the holes where iron clamps once sat, you are witnessing an economy written in negative space. Material drawn away, and yet not destroyed, redistributed into the city's skin. The Colosseum, in its ruin, still asserts agency, not as a pristine relic sealed in a museum, but as an element of a living city that has always been in motion. So, isn't it worth the trouble? If by trouble we mean the long-term commitment to study, stabilize, and interpret, yes. The effort buys us the chance to hold a complex story in our hands, a tale of ambition, of civic ritual, of ad hoc survival, of sanctioned transfer, of geological fragility, of the shifting modes of meaning assigned by later generations. It buys us a place to practice a measured ethics of heritage, a practice that understands that some losses are irrevocable, that restoration must be humble, and that conservation is as much about transmitting questions as preserving stone. If this message resonates with you, if the question of how we treat our built past intrigues you, consider subscribing for more explorations of the monuments that shape our cities and our stories. The Colosseum ends as it began, an object that keeps asking us to read it. It is both tomb and bulletin board, a vessel of spectacle and a storehouse of reuse. Its gaps are legible. They map choices made by people who lived with different urgencies. Preserving it is, therefore, not a cure for nostalgia, but a commitment to keeping a conversation alive between eras. That conversation asks how we balance needs and ideals, how we decide what is worth keeping and why. The Colosseum is worth the trouble, not because it can be restored to a pristine past, it cannot, but because in its ruin it continues to teach us about continuity, adaptation, and the layered life of a city. To conserve it is to choose to listen.